It began with a dare. I wasn't the type to scare easily. Ghost stories, fun.horror movies, bring it on. But when my college roommate Jake brought up Skinwalker legends on a late-night drive, his face pale with genuine fear, I brushed it off. "Come on, man," I said, laughing as he recounted stories about cursed witches who could steal your face and mimic your voice. "You really believe that?" "It's not about belief," Jake muttered, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "It's about respect. You don't mess with things you don't understand." By the time we pulled into the dirt lot at Hollow Woods, he looked uneasy. It was a small campsite, just 4 of us. Me, Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and her friend Megan. We'd planned the trip to get away from the city and disconnect for the weekend, but Jake's stories stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind as we unloaded our gear under a canopy of towering pines. The first night was uneventful. We roasted marshmallows, swapped stories, and laughed as Sarah tried to scare Megan with her own Skinwalker impressions. By the time the fire burned low, I felt relaxed, almost peaceful. But the woods didn't feel the same when I woke up. It was early, just before dawn, and a strange sound had pulled me from sleep. At first I thought it was Jake moving around in his tent. Then I realized it wasn't coming from his tent at all. It was outside, just beyond the tree line, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. Just stillness. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. But as I lay back down, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Jake's voice. "Help me." I froze. The words were faint, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. They came again, louder this time. "Help me, I'm hurt." I unzipped my tent, heart pounding, and stepped into the cold morning air. The campsite was bathed in an eerie gray light. Jake's tent was closed, his silhouette visible inside. So, who was calling for help? "Jake," I called, my voice trembling. The response came from deeper in the woods. "I'm over here, please." It sounded like Jake, but wrong. There was a distortion in his tone, like someone trying to imitate him, but not quite getting it right. My gut told me to wake the others, but curiosity pulled me forward. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches blocking out the rising sun. The voice grew fainter as I moved, as if it was deliberately leading me further away. Then it stopped. I turned in circles, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the shadows. "Jake!" I called again, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest answered with a laugh. It was high-pitched and broken, like the sound of a child's toy slowly winding down. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I swung the flashlight wildly, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal. It crouched low, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. But when it stood, I realized it was worse than any animal I'd ever seen. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with skin stretched tight over its gaunt frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its face was almost human, but not quite. The features were blurred, like a painting smudged by careless hands. "Jake," it croaked in that same distorted voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Jake, is that you?" it asked again, grinning now. Its teeth were too many, too sharp. I ran, branches clawed at my face as I tore through the woods, my breath ragged and my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I burst back into the clearing, collapsing near the dying embers of our fire. Jake was there, sitting up in his tent, groggy and confused. "Dude, what's going on?" I couldn't answer. The others woke soon after, and I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my words sounded insane, even to me. Jake joked that I must have been dreaming, but his unease was obvious. He kept glancing at the tree line, his jaw tight. The second night, the forest came alive. We were gathered around the fire again when the whistling started. It was faint at first, blending with the crackle of the flames. Then it grew louder, sharper, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "What is that?" Megan whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. Jake didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness, his face pale. Stay close to the fire, he muttered finally. Whatever you do, don't leave the circle. The whistling stopped, then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just out of sight. Sarah screamed as something darted between the trees, a flash of pale skin and glowing eyes. They're watching us, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. They? I asked, panic rising in my throat. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he stood, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. Stay here, he said, his voice trembling. No, Jake, don't! Sarah pleaded, but he was already moving toward the shadows. Come out, he shouted, waving the branch. I'm not afraid of you. The forest responded with laughter, high-pitched, overlapping voices, each one more distorted than the last. They echoed through the trees, growing louder, closer. Then we saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their twisted forms illuminated by the firelight. There were 3 of them, each more grotesque than the last. Their limbs were too long, their faces too smooth, like mannequins brought to life. Their eyes burned like coals, fixed on Jake as he stood frozen in place. One of them spoke. It was my voice. Jake, it said, grinning wide. Why did you bring them here? Jake stumbled back, dropping the branch. The creatures moved closer, their movements unnaturally fluid. And then they ran. It was a blur of motion, too fast to comprehend. The fire went out in a rush of cold air, plunging us into darkness. I heard Jake scream, followed by the sound of something wet and crunching. I grabbed Sarah and Megan, dragging them toward the car. The creatures didn't follow, but their laughter did, echoing through the trees until we finally broke free of the forest. Jake was never found, and now, even months later, I hear that whistle outside my window some nights. I don't look, I don't answer, because I know it's not him.